Hi, and welcome to Engineering Ethics at NJIT. I'm your instructor, Dan Estrada, and this is Lesson 3, Ethics and Consequences. Let's go and jump into the class. Alright, so this is Lesson 3. Lesson 3 starts a new unit of the course, where we're going to be doing two new things. Our first two units of the course, we were thinking very generally about the relationship between ethics, values, and engineering projects. In Lesson 3, we're going to start introducing some ethical theories to help you think about your ethical decision-making. None of these theories are right or wrong, and the goal isn't to convince you of any of these theories. The goal is just to introduce you to these different ways of thinking about and reasoning about our ethical decisions. And we're going to our first ethical theory is consequentialism. Our three theories, just so you know, is consequentialism first, and then deontology, or duty ethics, and then virtue ethics is our final. And over the next few weeks, we're going to be introducing these new theories and going through another case study. This is our second major case study, and we're going to spend a few weeks on this particular case study. This is the Ford Pinto. So the readings this week are all about introducing either consequentialism or the Pinto case. Readings from your textbook. I also have you read Mark Dowie's Pinto Madness, which is this 1977 expose published in Mother Jones magazine. It's an investigative journalism magazine. Mark Dowie finds this memo from within Ford where they do this kind of consequentialist reasoning, and we'll look at that decision. I also have some optional readings on famine and charity, and also another optional reading on big tobacco. All right, so I'm going to jump into the Prezi. All right, so Lesson 3, Ethics and Consequences. So like I said, our major ethical theory introduced this week is consequentialism. Consequentialism is just a general term for ethical theories that make decisions on the basis of the consequences of the actions of the different decisions. So any ethical view that makes its decision in light of the consequences or outcomes of various decisions is a kind of consequentialist reasoning. This goes by various names: cost-benefit analysis, weighing the pros and cons, weighing alternatives. You've probably done decision-making like this, maybe when you were applying to college or deciding what major to go into. You might have made a pro-con list, right, of the different majors, what are the benefits and drawbacks in order to decide. Maybe you didn't, but this is a very common, very intuitive way of reasoning about decisions. Not just ethical decisions, but any decision. What are the benefits, what are the drawbacks? So an ethical theory, when you're making ethical decisions based on the consequences of an action, this is called consequentialism. Means-ends reasoning, or instrumental reasoning, sometimes called Machiavellian reasoning. The ends justify the means. This is also a kind of consequentialism. Doing bad things for the sake of their consequences is a kind of consequentialism, and we'll see cases like this. But the most common version of consequentialism, most philosophers who identify as consequentialists will also identify as utilitarians. Utilitarianism is a kind of consequentialism. It's a specific kind of consequentialism that says that's a particular thing that we should be optimizing for. When we're weighing the costs and benefits, what we should be weighing for is happiness, utility. Utility is just another word for happiness here, and the utilitarians operate on what they call the principle of utility. The principle of utility says that we should maximize happiness, and in particular, we should maximize the greatest good for the greatest number. And the idea is that what's good for everyone is being happy in a very general sense. Not just feeling good, because maybe merely feeling good, having good feelings, is not enough to be truly happy. Utilitarians are willing to be to think about happiness in complicated ways, but once we settle on that we want to maximize happiness, utilitarians are the views of consequentialism that wants to maximize happiness. Again, there's other kinds of consequentialists. I might not want to maximize happiness, but I might want to maximize my bank account, right? The size of my bank account, how much money I have. If I make decisions based on what makes me the most money, that's a kind of consequentialism, right? I'm thinking about the consequences, but I'm not thinking about the general happiness. What I'm thinking about is how much money I have. And you can think, that these two might come apart, that if I just purely pursue money, at the sake of my family and friends and so on, social life, then maybe I won't be very happy. Maybe I'll be really rich, but I won't be very happy. These are both kinds of consequentialism, and the difference is, what am I trying to maximize? What am I trying to pursue? And you might try to pursue a bank account, but if you think that other things matter besides money, you might be a utilitarian. Utilitarians want to maximize happiness. So money plays into happiness, but maybe so does having good friends and having a good family life and recreational activities and having good hobbies and that kind of stuff. And the utilitarian wants to say that some combination of these things makes us happy, and what we want to do when we're making ethical decisions is promote the greatest happiness. Not just my personal happiness, but the greatest happiness for the greatest number. And this is the utilitarian slogan from John Stuart Mill. He says we want to increase the greatest happiness for the greatest number. So another kind of consequentialism that's not utilitarianism that the book talks about is egoism. We'll talk more in detail about egoism later on. But egoism is just the idea that I should always try to be, I should always act in a way that makes my life best, makes me happiest. So this is kind of a selfish ethic. We'll argue later that it might not even be an ethical view exactly. But the idea that I just maximize benefits for myself. Right? So maybe in that case I am trying to maximize my own happiness. But maybe maximizing my own happiness could come at a great cost for others. For instance, stealing candy from a baby. Right? So maybe I see a baby and it's got a lollipop and I want that lollipop for myself. So I steal the lollipop. So I get some pleasure from having that lollipop. And if all I'm trying to do is maximize my own happiness, then maybe I steal that lollipop. But the baby, when I steal the candy, the baby starts crying and the baby has a fit, and maybe he has a fit for 20 minutes or whatever. And you might think that, okay, so maybe it does increase my happiness a little bit, right? The lollipop is a little bit good, but it increases the pain or the suffering of the child, and the parents have to take care of that child, and everyone around has to hear that child screaming and so on, right? The general pain and unhappiness, suffering for people is raised, and most importantly for the utilitarian, that the amount of suffering that's caused by my stealing the candy does not outweigh the amount of pleasure that I get from eating that candy. So it's true that I get a little bit of pleasure from eating that candy, but look at all the unhappiness that I caused, right? And that unhappiness far outweighs any pleasure that I get. Right, so utilitarian is not just maximizing happiness for yourself, but maximizing the greatest good for the greatest number, maximizing the overall happiness, so that overall happiness is maximized. Like I said, the utilitarians are willing to be a little bit delicate about how to define happiness. It's not just feeling good, it's also living a good life. And we'll talk a little bit more about well-being when we talk about virtue ethics. But utilitarians also care about well-being in a general sense. From John Stuart Mill, the quote is, it's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. It's better to be a pig satisfied than it's better to be a human dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. It's better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. The idea is that it's better to have certain kinds of higher pleasures or intellectual pleasures than it is to have sort of base animal pleasures. Right, so all animals enjoy sex, maximizing sex for all the people. John Stuart Mill, most utilitarians are going to say, well, that's good, but there's better having a good education and healthcare and running water or refrigeration. Right, these are the kinds of things that lead to genuine happiness, and mere orgies in the street. It might be pleasurable, but it's not real happiness. It's not real well-being. Or something like that. Okay. So utilitarians want to maximize greatest happiness for the greatest number. It's really important for the utilitarian view that this way of weighing alternatives can be done in something like a formal or quantifiable way. That it's not just my opinion versus your opinion, but that we're actually thinking about what helps people out, and that we should do the thing that helps out the most people, that makes the most people most happy. And the way that utilitarians have for discussing the quantified aspects of this in some detail is the trolley case. So you might have heard of the trolley problem before. This is pretty popular. It's pretty well known. So the trolley problem works like this. Here's a trolley. It's barreling down this track. And the idea is that something's broken on the trolley so that it can't stop. And if it keeps going down this track, it's going to run over 5 people. In this image, the 5 people are tied to the track. But don't imagine them tied to the track. Imagine that they're just standing near the track. And the trolley's going, barreling down, and those people aren't paying attention. And if nothing happens, then the trolley's going to hit those 5 people and it's going to kill all 5. But you just happen to be standing there, so you're this person, and you just happen to be standing right next to a lever. It's the switch in the track, and if you pull this lever, then the trolley will be diverted from its main track and go onto this side track. On this side track, there's still another person standing there, and because you pull the lever, this person is now going to die. But although this person gets sacrificed, you do save the lives of these 5 people. And so the trolley problem question is, should you pull this lever? Right? If you don't pull the lever, the trolley will kill 5 people. If you do pull the lever, it'll kill a different person. It'll kill one person who wouldn't have been killed otherwise. But you save the lives of these 5 people. They go unharmed. So the question is, do you pull the lever? A utilitarian is going to say, well, yes, you should pull the lever, because the question here is 5 lives versus 1 life. And even if you know nothing else about ethics, it's clear that if you have an option of saving 5 lives versus saving 1 life, you should always save the 5 lives. Yes, it's tragic that the one person dies. Yes, it's a terrible thing that the one person dies. But other things equal, that one person's life is multiplied 5 times over on the other side of the tracks. So just in terms of sheer quantity, you ought to save the 5 people, because that's 5 different people as opposed to the one person, who's just one person. Now, this might be difficult because, look, you're pulling the lever, and by pulling that lever, you're causing this one person to die who wouldn't have died except for your actions. So in some sense, you're killing a person. But the utilitarian wants to say that despite killing, you shouldn't kill people normally, and if you can help it, you shouldn't kill this person. But killing this person in this instance, while that's tragic, it does save these 5 other lives. And you should always try to maximize happiness. Saving 5 lives will make more people happy than just saving this one person's life. So the utilitarian says you ought to pull the lever, that in fact you have some ethical obligation. If your obligation is to maximize happiness, then if you find yourself in the trolley situation, then you ought to pull the lever. Then you have some ethical obligation to pull the lever. And that if you fail to pull the lever, if you see the situation and you see that you could save those 5 people's lives, but you don't, you're like, I'm not going to get involved. If you just step away. You might think that stepping away and not getting involved frees you of any guilt or any responsibility for what happens. But the utilitarian is going to say, no, look, you could have taken a very simple action to save 5 lives, and because you didn't do that, you're also responsible for the consequences. Right? So inaction is a kind of action in this case. You don't get out of it by not doing anything, but if you just step back, put your hands in the air, that still makes you guilty of failing to act, failing to save those 5 people's lives. So utilitarian says you have an obligation to maximize happiness, and in this case, in the trolley case, pulling the lever is what maximizes happiness. So think about that. Come to Hangouts or come to class so we can talk about the trolley problem. It's a good case. And then there's a sort of generic case. And then there's all sorts of specializations of this case, right? So imagine instead of 5 people versus 1 people, imagine that this one person on the sidetrack is your mom. And these 5 people are just strangers, but this is your mother. Do you still pull that lever? The utilitarian is going to say that you should still pull the lever, that it's still 5 people's happiness versus 1 person's happiness. I mean, maybe these people are all moms also, and all their children are going to be just as unhappy as you are from killing. Maybe you're going to be a little more unhappy because you're the person who actually killed your mom, but surely you're not 5 times more unhappy than all these people's kids. I mean, imagine each of these people are moms that have 5 kids each. Then you have 5 times already the unhappiness. So, I mean, you can work out the numbers, so it seems that even if you have a special relationship with this person, you should still pull the lever. This shows you where consequentialism gets a little bit difficult, right? Consequentialism it seems intuitive that you should try to maximize happiness. The problem is that consequentialism, if you think about it carefully, you're often in situations where you ought to do something that might make you really unhappy. It might be something you don't want to do, like kill your mom. But on utilitarian reasoning, it seems like you have an obligation to kill your mom because you are causing more unhappiness by letting your mom die. You cause more unhappiness to yourself by killing your mom, but the overall unhappiness is better if you let your mom die. So you might have some obligation to kill your mom. And then you can do this in the reverse, right? So what if this person is like, if this person is a known serial killer and these are all Nobel Prize winners or whatever, then it seems like you'll have a much easier time pulling the lever because maybe this person deserves to die. So you're reasoning about desert and justice. You're reasoning about special relationships. These change how you evaluate the formula, right? It doesn't mean that it changes who's happy or not, but special relationships and with these people mean that you might evaluate it differently. And consequentialism is supposed to bring out the difficulties that we have in doing these reasonings. For instance, my favorite variation, it's also a very standard variation, is a fat man. It's a fat man case. So this is a little bit perhaps insensitive, but this is from a philosophical paper. The Trolley Problem cases come from philosophy articles, scholars. People made their philosophy careers by writing about the Trolley Problem cases back in the 70s. One of the original variations was the fat man case. So imagine instead, so in the original case, there's the trolley and then there's the switch where you can pull it onto the sidetrack. So in this case, there's no sidetrack. It's just the trolley's barreling down to kill these 5 people. You're standing by, and you also happen to be standing, just by coincidence, you happen to be standing by this very large man, overweight man. And you're an engineer, and you are able to do the calculations really quickly in your head, and you realize that this man is just large enough that if you push him onto the track, that he has enough mass to stop the trolley in the track before it hits the 5 people. You're on a bridge and pushing him off the bridge, but just something that you push him in the way of the trolley, and you can tell just from looking at it that it's enough so that the trolley stops before it hits the other 5 people. So do you push the fat man? Most people say that they don't push the fat man, which is interesting because most people say that they do pull the lever. And one of the things the utilitarians are going to point out is that these are somewhat inconsistent, right? Pulling the lever results in 1 person dying versus 5 people dying. Pushing the fat man also results in 1 person dying versus 5 people dying. I mean, assuming that you can do the calculations properly and everything, it's 1 person dead versus 5 people dead. And most people in those calculations are willing to pull the lever, but much fewer people are willing to push the fat man on the track. And the things they say is that you have to actually touch the person. It feels more like killing them when you're actually touching them, when there's this personal interaction, versus the original trolley case where you're just pulling this lever. And this raises another kind of problem with this consequentialist reasoning. This is called the problem of distance. That the farther you are away from the bad thing that happens, the less responsibility and guilt you personally feel for that action. Right? In both this case and the fat man case, if you make the choice to kill the person, you're killing 1 person. But people are more willing to do it if you're not actually touching the person, but if you're just pulling the lever. Right? A person dies either way, but pulling the lever gives you some psychological distance between you and the consequences of your action. And so you're more willing to do it. On the utilitarian view, this doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's not a difference in happiness. And maybe, I guess, for you personally, maybe you'd be haunted by the feeling of pushing the guy on the lever, or pushing the guy on the tracks, and you don't get that same feeling from pulling the lever, maybe. But the point here is that the further you are away, the more intermediate steps there are between you and what happens. the less guilt you feel, the less personally responsible you feel. Right? So if you're in the factory making the gun, you don't feel as responsible for all of the people that gun ends up killing, because look, there's a bunch of steps between you and that death, right? So you're just pulling the lever, and someone dies later on in that process, but you don't feel personally responsible. So this is again another challenge in thinking in this sort of consequentialist way, in these utilitarian ways, is that it's often not just the greatest happiness that's motivating our actions, right? These kinds of special relationships, these kinds of distance issues, have an impact on whether or not we make a choice, and that's independent of how it affects the overall happiness. So there's a lot of variations of these trolley problems. There's actually a Facebook group to trolley problems memes. It's pretty popular. And so the hedonist trolley problem: track's heading towards track B. If you pull the lever to switch it to track A, it'll kill fewer people, but it also won't do this totally sick loop-to-loop. Do you pull the lever? Right. Okay. There's a lot of variations where you change the characteristics of the people, right? So in this one, the person A is 1 year old, and everyone on track B is 90 years old. So they're all going to die soon anyway. This person has their whole life ahead of them. Do you pull the lever or not? Etc. Yeah, so and you can probably make up more trolley problem variations of your own. In fact, we'll look at some of these when we do the autonomous car debates in the later part of the class. These kinds of trolley problem questions, either are questions, have become a kind of popular tool in the toolkit of philosophers and ethicists. So we'll see lots of variations of these kinds of trolley problem cases. Think about your own reaction to these cases. Again, the part of the point of these cases is to, in some sense, reduce the ethical decision to a quantified problem, right, where there's numbers on both sides, 1 versus 5. And you can use your evaluation of the numbers on each side to determine what to do. And this brings us to our next case study, the Ford Pinto. Because we'll see that the Ford Pinto, in dealing with the fact that these Ford Pintos exploded, Ford had to make a consequentialist decision, and we'll see the results that come up. So this is the Pinto. Pinto was manufactured between 1971 and 1978. It was a car released in the 70s. Remember, there was like a gas crisis in the 70s. It was some crazy times in the 70s. During this time period, there were a lot of foreign economy cars coming onto the market, especially from Japan, Korea, also from Europe. Right, these sort of small, extremely fuel-efficient cars were starting to become popular. They were cheap. There was an economic recession, right? So these cheap economy cars were becoming very popular. Ford wanted to get in on the game, and they wanted to get in on it fast in order to be competitive in the market. So they pushed through this Pinto. The Pinto was Lee Iacocca's personal mission. So Lee Iacocca was the CEO of Ford, and the Pinto was called Lee's car. And Lee wanted that car on the market today, and he had some constraints on how it's going to be built. In particular, he wanted it for no more than $2,000 and no more than 2,000 pounds. Right? He wanted it light. He wanted it cheap. And he was willing to go to extremes to get it to fit in those specifications. In particular, the Pinto manufacturing, in general for car manufacturing, what you do is you make up the designs, then you make some prototypes, then you test those prototypes in a bunch of different situations. Once you are sure that the prototype is sound, then you take those parts and then you mass produce them in order to build the final product. So this is how the process normally goes, but in order to get this car on the market quickly, Lee Iacocca made these two processes go in parallel. Instead of serial, he made them go in parallel, so that they were prototyping and testing at the same time that they were manufacturing in mass. And what that meant is that when they discovered the safety concerns with the car, they were already producing millions of them. and the cost that would be required to go and fix the problem would have been too expensive. Let me explain what the problem was. So these kinds of cheap economy cars are not going to have very many safety features on them. Safety features are expensive and they are heavy, and so you have this sort of de-emphasizing. There's Lee Iacocca making that Pinto. $50 down payment, that's pretty good. Okay, so here's the problem. So in the back of the car is where the fuel tank was, sitting in the very rear of the car, and there was nothing protecting that fuel tank from exposure to the rear bumper, where the bumper was made of metal, and if there was any kind of rear collision, the bumper would bend in and puncture the fuel tank, and gas would go everywhere. And when the gas was going everywhere, any kind of spark, and these cars were made of metal, so any kind of metal on metal spark would cause the whole thing to go up in a fireball. We can watch that here. So this will show some of the crash tests that were done in the early 70s. So it's important to know that these crash tests were done while the manufacturing was happening, while these cars were being sold. The engineers, the safety engineers, knew about these problems as the manufacturing was happening. They ran these tests. This is a test from 1971. No, it was 1972. The car's going at 35 miles an hour. These kinds of fireballs would happen in rear-end collisions as low as 20 miles an hour, so like residential speeds. But here's 35 miles an hour. Yeah. In the movies from the 70s, you see cars going up in flames all the time. That's because cars would actually go up in flames from these very minor collisions. Not only would it go up in flames, but the whole rear end of the car would compress, and it would jam the door, so that anyone inside the car would basically be stuck in there in a big flaming ball of fire. And in fact, people died in exactly this way. A car full of girls was rear-ended by a van, and they all burned alive inside. This happened more than a few times. So again, Ford knew about this problem. Their engineers were doing these safety tests, and they knew about it. Not only did they know about the problem, but they knew how to fix it also. In fact, they had a patent for exactly the part needed to fix the problem. It was just a little metal shielding, like a little piece of metal. It was a plate that you put on the back of the gas tank, so that in a rear-end collision, especially at low speeds, the metal blocks the gas tank from being punctured. They knew how to build this part. They had the patent for this part. That part would have cost $11. It would have weighed a few pounds more, about $65 today. But that cost and that weight would have put it over the £2,000, $2,000 limit, and Lee Iacocca was just not hearing any of it. He refused to even consider these kinds of changes. He even had a catchphrase, and he had it on a plaque on his desk. His catchphrase was "Safety doesn't sell." And safety is the secret word for the lecture for this week. You can put that in. You can put that in the attendance for lesson 3. Safety will get you attendance credit for this week. Safety doesn't sell. So let me give just a little bit of context here about the Ford Pinto. So this is, again, released in early 70s. And there's economic recession. There's these foreign competitors coming onto the market that are sort of pushing Ford out of their comfortable business. The automobile industry was also under attack at this time in the early 70s from Ralph Nader and this safe car movement. So in 1965, Ralph Nader, who was a consumer advocate, Ralph Nader, he ran for president a couple of times, didn't win obviously, but he was a consumer advocate. He was a guy who would write these books about safety concerns in these automobiles, and he would lobby Congress on the back of this popular support in order to change the laws. So Ralph Nader is the guy to credit or blame for the fact that we all require seatbelts now, right? So in cars today, you require seatbelts. This is a law across the country. This didn't used to be a law. It used to be that people died quite a bit more, and these cars were very, very dangerous. And Ralph Nader got this changed. So how dangerous was it? You should know how many people die every year from car accidents just in the United States. In 2014, 32,000 people were killed in car accidents, in 29,000 car accidents. Somewhere between 32 and 35,000 people every year die from traffic accidents. Far more people are injured from traffic accidents. 35,000 people every year. 35,000 people, that's the size of a small town. The town that I grew up in was 25,000 people. So that was like 10,000 more people than my entire town killed every year. Just wiped off the map every year from car accidents. That's a lot of people. And on a utilitarian reasoning, you might think that what we're doing here is we're willing to tolerate 35,000 people dying every year, 2,000 children under the age of 16, dying every year, injuring 2 million people every year. That's what we're willing to tolerate for the convenience of an automobile. Yes, 35,000 people die every year, but I get to do fast food. Yeah. I live in New York City. I don't own a car, so I don't know how many of you all own cars. But, it's a little bit different here on the East Coast, but where we have good public transportation. But America has a fascination with these cars, even when they're extremely dangerous. And let me also point out this graph. This is how many people die every year. So in the early part of car history, quite a lot of people died. There's a sort of spike. There's this trough here during the war. During the war, fewer cars are being made because all the metal is going to the war effort, and fewer people are driving around because they're all overseas in the war. So this little sort of dip where not as many people die. But then in the 70s, in the 50s, 60s, and 70s, during the Pinto sort of craze, this thing spikes to over 50,000. So nowadays, 35,000 people die every year from cars. Back in the 60s and 70s, over 50,000 people were dying every year from car accidents. There were fewer cars on the road, there were fewer people were driving fewer miles, but significantly more people were dying from auto accidents. And the reason people were dying was because the cars just weren't safe. Cars were death machines. There's still death traps. The highway system, our vehicle system, is a meat grinder. It kills tens of thousands of people every year. But it was even worse a few decades ago. So I like to show this video. I think I've even shown this in some of the classes, but...
That's the Insurance Institute for Highway Safety's front crash of a 2009 Chevrolet Malibu in 1959 Chevrolet Bel Air. In slow motion, you can see the differences in how the new and classic cars perform in this version of the traditional frontal offset test. The Institute conducted this test to commemorate its 50th anniversary, and it dramatically shows how much improvement has been made in passenger protection since the nonprofit organization opened its doors. The two cars collide in an explosion of metal, glass, and plastics. Where the Malibu crumple zone absorbs much of the crash forces ahead of the windshield, the Bel Air structure allows the lighter car to compress the passenger compartment. The impact is made worse for the Bel Air driver by the lack of airbags, head restraint, and even a seat belt. As a result, injuries to the neck, chest, and both legs would be likely. Consequently, the Bel Air receives a poor rating across the board. On the other hand, the modern Malibu provides good protection, with the dummy movement being well controlled. Measures indicate a low risk to most body regions, though a foot injury would be possible. Beyond the safety gear, advancements in vehicle engineering give the Malibu a clear advantage in this matchup. While classic cars are often considered to be rock solid, this 59 demonstrates how much better today's cars are. And the IHS has played a key role in driving these advancements. In the past 50 years, the Institute has made a real impact. The roads today are safer for it. For complete safety information, subscribe to...
Yeah, okay, good. So, we often think about these old cars as being safe, solid, dependable, built like a tank. But in fact, they were death traps. They were extremely unsafe, and people died in the tens of thousands, 50,000 people a year in the 50s were dying because these cars were very unsafe. Because they had no safety features, they had no airbags, they had no crumple zones. Right, the whole thing was just shattered, and it was built for aesthetics. It was built for the way it looked, and not for whether it was safe. Right, the column just goes straight into the guy's face. Yeah. So those were the cars in this era where lots and lots of people were dying. And then Ralph Nader releases his Unsafe at Any Speed. He gets a huge well of public support behind him, and then there starts being all these laws about safety belts and airbags and so on. And that's why today there's fewer people dying from car accidents. Even though there's more people on the road, there's more miles driven, fewer people are dying every year because the cars are just a lot safer. Because the cars have a lot of safety features. People object to these safety features. People sometimes complain about seatbelts, but they literally save lives. There's no question about it. You might not like it. You might think it's aesthetically unpleasing, but lives are saved on any consequentialist reasoning. We have to support that. Okay, so in the 60s and early 70s, you have this sort of pushback against these cars, but Lee Iacocca was not having any of it. Lee Iacocca, his policy was that safety doesn't sell. In the 60s and in the early 70s, he was like, look, consumers don't want these safety features. They're not willing to pay for these safety features, especially on an economy car like this. When someone's buying a car like this, they want a cheap car. They don't want a safe car. In fact, they know they're sacrificing some safety for the economy, right, for the cash value. So people don't expect this car to be safe. So Lee Iacocca wasn't going to give him a safe car. And they knew that there was this rear-end collision, explosion, and fireball possibility. They also knew that it would, how to fix it. They knew it would take $11 part to fix it. But they didn't, and they didn't for this reason. So in 1977, the Pinto had already been on the market for 6 years. It started in 1971. It goes off the market in 78 as a result of this article. But Mark Dowie, he's a journalist. He gets a hold of what's called the Pinto Memo, and he publishes it in Mother Jones. And in this Pinto Memo, he talks about Lee Iacocca's whole culture against safety. But the really damning thing in the article is this Pinto Memo, where they make a calculation. Because by the time that they discovered this fault, they'd already manufactured 12 million vehicles, 12.5 million vehicles. And so an $11 part on 12.5 million vehicles, right, and to do the recall, just to put this part on all these vehicles, never mind all the cost of the recall and informing all the customers and so on, that would cost on 12 million vehicles, $137 million. $137 million to fix all the cars. On the other hand, Ford says, if we don't fix the cars, and instead we think about how many people are actually going to die from car accidents like this, and how many people are going to be injured, and then how much will it cost to settle in court for damages as a result of these deaths. Well, Ford estimates that about 180 people would die from these injuries, from this failure, and at about $200,000 per death. And then also about 180 injuries at about $67,000 per injury. And about 2,100 burned cars at about $700 a car. All of that. In other words, if we don't do anything, we just let the damages happen and then settle in court, that would cost us about $50 million. So Ford reasons it's $137 million to fix the cars and prevent anyone from dying. And then if we just let a bunch of people die, it'll cost us about $50 million. It's almost a third, right? It's way less than half. Mark Dowie says in the article, the cost-benefit analysis argued that Ford should not make the $11 per car improvement that would prevent 180 fiery deaths a year. The member argues that there's no financial benefit in complying with fewer safety standards that would admittedly result in fewer auto fires, fewer burn deaths, and fewer burn injuries. So this is clearly a kind of consequentialist reasoning. This is cost-benefit analysis, right? This is looking at the cost on one hand versus cost on the other hand. But the utilitarian is going to be very clear that this is not utilitarian reasoning. We're not worried about the overall happiness, because presumably in a world where no one dies versus a world where 180 people die and 180 people are burned, that there's more happiness in the case where no one dies, even if you have to spend a lot more money. If you have to spend $80 million more to prevent 180 people from dying, well, 180 people might be worth that $80 million. And more importantly, maybe Ford as a corporation has some obligation to prevent those 180 people from dying if it knows it can. Right? The fact that they refuse to save these lives in order to save $80 million, $87 million, this seems horrific. It seems like they're putting a cost on human life. They're literally putting a cost on human life. I will say there's some complications here. Ford doesn't put this cost on human life themselves. These are numbers taken from government actuarial tables. So the federal government builds these actuarial tables in order to estimate life insurance policies and so on. And their cost was $200,000 per death. And so Ford was saying $200,000 per death plus times 180 projected deaths in order to get its figure. Yeah. So that's consequentialist reasoning. Maybe not utilitarian reasoning. Maybe it's not looking at overall happiness. Maybe it's just looking at the financial bottom line. This is maybe one of these cases where consequentialism and utilitarianism come apart a little bit. So did Ford make the right decision here? How would a utilitarian have decided differently? What factors went into Ford's decision? What was the scope of their consideration, and should it have been broader? Were they adequately accounting for safety issues? In particular, think about this quote, "Safety doesn't sell." Think about this especially in light of the NSPE Code of Ethics, where the health, safety, and welfare is the paramount concern for ethics and engineering. What is the ethics of the Iacocca's policy here? I mean, Ford's a business. They have to make a profit. So should this be their primary concern? Or does Ford have some obligation to maybe operate at less of a profit in order to save lives, especially if they know they can and they know that they're putting these lives in danger? I guess it's worth following up here that as a result of Mark Dowie's article, there's a huge public backlash against the Pinto. The Pinto is eventually pulled off the market in 1978. Ford still makes economy cars, but they don't make the Pinto anymore. Like I said, a Pinto full of girls ended up dying as a result of one of these rear-end collisions, and it was brought to court, and in fact it ends up being the first court case where a corporation is brought up on charges of criminal manslaughter, of resulting in a criminal death. So this is the first time that a corporation has been charged with has been brought up on charges of causing someone to die. But Ford ends up being found not guilty. They end up evading these charges, at least for the criminal violation. There's a civil violation where they are found guilty, but they end up not paying very much. There's an initial settlement of something like $20 million per death, which is huge. But that ends up getting whittled way down, so that Ford ends up only paying something like $5 million. Yeah, even less than they expected that they would pay. Not counting all the legal fees and so on. So Ford isn't found guilty of causing the deaths, but this is the first time where a corporation is brought up on charges of this sort, and eventually we'll find a case where the corporations are found guilty. The Deepwater Horizon case, in particular, BP is found guilty of negligence that leads to the death of some of its engineers. The public backlash against the Pinto in this case not only ends the Pinto, and it hurts Ford's reputation quite a lot. I mean, Ford, was deliberately selling vehicles that they knew would kill people, that they anticipated would kill people, that they were expecting to have to pay out in court for killing people, and they put that vehicle out on the road anyway, without telling the consumers, without having any kind of awareness. So, Ford has a serious reputation hit as a result of this, and part of the consequences is that nowadays we do take safety seriously. Right, nowadays, safety ratings matter for how people buy cars. People look at safety ratings. They consider it an important factor in their vehicle decisions. It's not always the deciding factor, but it's something that people care about. And now there's also a bunch of laws about seatbelts and airbags and so on. Right. Partly because of this really dramatic and very public controversy over Ford's decision-making in this case, we now have much safer cars as a result. Now, our cars aren't perfectly safe, and you see recalls all the time for safety issues, brakes failing, and so on. And if you know more about automobiles and about the safety concerns with automobiles, please share your knowledge about the Ford. If any of you are continuing students coming back and were alive when the Ford was around and want to talk about it, that might be interesting also. Like I said, we're not done talking about the Pinto yet. Today we just introduced the Pinto, and I really want you to just get a sense of the technical issues with the Pinto and the sort of historical, what happened, and sort of timeline about what happened with the Pinto. Next week, we're going to continue talking about the Pinto, and we're going to look at Dennis Gioia's story. Dennis Gioia was the field recall coordinator at Ford. He was the guy who was responsible for issuing a recall, but he doesn't. And he wrote up an article called Pinto Fires and Personal Ethics, where he explains why he didn't, why he made the decision to not issue a recall. So we'll look next week at the person who could have made the decision to stop the Pinto from going on the road, why he didn't make that decision. And then we're going to continue with the Pinto in week 5, where we talk about whistleblowing, and we use the Pinto as a sort of test case about whether someone should whistleblow. Should someone have done something more? Should Dennis Gioia have said something more? So we're going to stick with the Pinto for the next 2 weeks, get used to the case, think about it, do some independent research. I linked to the Wikipedia page. There's the video. Do some research about the Pinto, learn for yourself what happens with the Pinto. And think about consequentialism, think about the trolley problem, how it's relating. I just want to just briefly go over this. Maybe we'll talk about this more in the Hangout and in class. But Peter Singer is a famous utilitarian. He's maybe one of the more famous philosophical utilitarians. And he gives an article on famine and charity. And the upshot of the article is about these extreme sacrifices that consequentialism seems to require us that we do. So in the example, he gives the following case. It's a kind of trolley problem case. So imagine that I'm standing next to a kiddie pool where there's a child, like a 5-year-old, like a small child, in this kiddie pool, and they're drowning. Like they're struggling and they're drowning and they're breathing in water. And if no one does anything to save this kid, they're going to die. And it's right next to me, and this kiddie pool is sitting right next to me. And I'm the only adult around. I'm the only person who's in a position to save this child. But it would require stepping into the kiddie pool. And I happen to be wearing these really nice shoes, these suede, these just very nice shoes, very expensive shoes. And they're suede, and suede doesn't work well with water. And if I step into that pool to save that child, I'm just going to ruin these shoes. They're like my favorite shoes. I was planning on going out with them tonight. I have this really important date. It would mean a lot to me to wear these shoes tonight. But if I step into this pool and save this child, then the shoes are ruined. I can't wear them tonight. My date's ruined. Basically, my life's ruined. So I decide that I shouldn't save the child for the sake of these shoes. They're like $500 shoes. They're really expensive, really nice shoes. And I decide, in this case, that my $500 shoes are more important to me than the life of this child. Now, hopefully you're seeing this case and you think that I'm a moral monster, that there's no justification for not saving the life of the child. It doesn't matter how expensive they could be $1,000, $1,500 shoes. No shoes are worth the life of a child. That child is always more important. You should always save the child over saving your shoes. And then Singer says, well, now look. It seems real easy to talk about this in the case where the child's drowning right next to me, but every day there are children who are starving and dying from malnutrition or lack of access to medical supplies or lack of access to other kinds of resources. And it would not be that hard for me to give up some of my money, especially some of the luxury items that I spend on myself, right? That video game system, right? The PlayStation and 3 video games, that's already like $1,000. And that's $1,000 I don't really need. I mean, like, it's nice to have that stuff. It's nice to be able to play video games, but that's a huge expense. And my life would not be that worse off if I gave up that expense and donated that $1,000 to charity. But, and the charity can use that $1,000 to literally save people's lives, right? So children who might have died otherwise are now able to live because of this money. And the only sacrifice to you is your ability not to play these video games. Now, if you think that you should give up your suede shoes to save the drowning child in the kiddie pool, then Peter Singer says, by the very same argument, by the very same reasoning, you should be giving up your luxury items in order to give to charity. You might say, well, charities sometimes waste the money, they don't use it very smartly. Well, yes, some charities do, but some charities don't. And in fact, there's a lot of watchdog groups that rank charities over how efficiently they use their funds, how much of the funds actually go to serving the populations that they claim that they're serving, and how much of it goes to, the bureaucracy and to lining the pockets of the managers and so on. Admittedly, there's some bad charities out there, but there are a lot of good charities who are doing really good work, who are actually saving lives. And Peter Singer's going to say that you have some obligation to donate to those charities in order to save lives, instead of just giving yourself these luxury items that you don't really need, that you could do without. It would be a relatively minor inconvenience to you relative to the lives that you save. So there's no... So Peter Singer says, on basic utilitarian grounds, there's no question that you should be giving more to charity. And the fact that we don't is a moral failure. It's that we're doing something morally wrong. You may or may not agree with him. You can read his article and make that argument. The other case that I wanted to talk about, here, let me pause this really quickly, is tobacco companies. So, charity isn't so much, doesn't have a whole lot to do with engineering ethics. The point of the charity examples is really think about consequentialism and what consequentialism demands of you. But tobacco executives and engineers who work for tobacco companies. So you might think tobacco companies, it's a big manufacturing industry, and we have to build a bunch of stuff, and that means that they need a bunch of engineers to build the machines to build all their cigarettes. So engineers get employed by the tobacco industries, and the tobacco industry builds death machines, and it builds cigarettes that kill people. Cigarettes kill people, first of all. Lung cancer is almost exclusively a smoker's disease. No one gets lung cancer except smokers, and people die of lung cancer all the time. So cigarettes are a thing that kills people. Not only does it kill people, but it's incredibly addictive, as addictive or more than heroin, cocaine, or whatever. Kills more people than those drugs also. It does it because it's legal. Right? Not only is it legal, but it's legally sanctioned, and you can just go to the corner store and buy cigarettes. Not every cigarette will kill you, but over time, the more cigarettes you smoke, the more likely you are to get cancer and die. And cigarette companies make their cigarettes to be as addictive as possible, right? To be as habit-forming as possible, right? So that, including like the size of the cigarette, the length of the cigarette, how much nicotine is in the cigarette, those things are all controlled very precisely to make it as compulsive as possible. In the same way that nowadays, they build games on your phone that are addictive habit forming. So too the cigarettes, except they're doing it with nicotine, they're doing it with chemicals, right? Chemical addiction. And they do it because they make a lot of money. You can sell cigarettes for a lot of money, and then you can keep people hooked on them for a long period of time, for 20, 30 years, and that makes a lot of money. And tobacco companies know that they're addictive, they know that they're habit forming, and they know that they kill people. They've known this for a long time, but they just flat out lie to the American public. So here are all the tobacco executives lying to Congress.
Whether each of you believes that nicotine is not addictive. I heard virtually all of you touch on it. And just yes or no. Do you believe nicotine is not addictive?
I believe nicotine is not addictive, yes.
Mr. Johnston.
Congressman, cigarettes and nicotine clearly do not meet the classic definitions of addiction. There is no intoxication.
We'll take that as a no. And again, time is short. If you could just, I think each of you believe nicotine is not addictive. We just would like to have this for the record.
I don't believe that nicotine or our products are addictive.
I believe nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
I believe that nicotine is not addictive.
And I too believe that nicotine is not addictive.
All right. Dr. Campbell, I assume that you're aware that your testimony, and you said in your testimony that nicotine is not addictive, is contradicted by an overwhelming number of authorities and associations. For example, in 1988, the Surgeon General of the United States wrote an entire report on this topic. The Surgeon General, of course, is the chief health advisor to our government. I assume you have reviewed that report?
Yes, I have, sir.
All right.
Yeah, so nicotine is extremely addictive. We've known about it for a long time. Surgeon General did a report in the 80s that it was that nicotine is addictive, incredibly addictive, and that it kills people. And we've known about it for a long time. But that was a video of all the CEOs of the major tobacco companies all testifying before Congress that they believe that nicotine is not addictive. That was during a major congressional hearing on the tobacco industry. It ended up being one of the largest lawsuits in history. The tobacco companies had to pay out hundreds of millions of dollars in lawsuits because Congress found that they were deliberately contributing to killing people. Right, so in particular that they were false advertising, saying that nicotine, not only was cigarettes, were they not addictive, but that they were healthy for you, that doctors recommend smoking cigarettes. Here's your dentist recommending that you smoke cigarettes because it has a filter, and that makes it better for you, says the dentist. An unnamed dentist and an unnamed cartoon dentist says that you should be smoking cigarettes. Not only do they do this sort of false advertising about the health of the cigarettes, but they also do this advertising to children, right? So here's Joe Camel, here's the kid buying cigarettes for mom and papa, and then Joe Camel advertising to children that cigarettes are cool, right? So you hook them young, and you keep them for a long period of time. That's how you make money off of them. And the tobacco industry has known this, has known that nicotine is addictive. They worked to suppress the research for a long time on the health effects of tobacco. Right, so there was a lot of research saying that cigarettes are dangerous, and tobacco executives, they deliberately suppressed that research. They deliberately put out counter research that says that cigarettes were just fine by researchers, by doctors they were paying to say that, right? In order to cause confusion among the public so that they didn't just abandon cigarettes entirely. And it took this effort from Congress, this huge trial, where they ended up putting hundreds of millions of dollars. So nowadays, and since the mid-90s, nowadays you're not allowed to have tobacco advertisements on TV. You're not allowed to advertise to children. And not only you're not allowed to advertise in particular ways with cigarettes, but, and more importantly, the tobacco companies pay for these truth out advertisements about the dangers of cigarettes. So there's this huge educational campaign about how dangerous cigarettes are. They have the labels on the cigarette boxes, but there's also all these advertisements that you see on TV and elsewhere talking about how dangerous cigarettes are, how many people they kill every year, and so on. So now most of you all know that cigarettes are dangerous. The only reason that you know that cigarettes are dangerous is because Congress sued the tobacco industry for hundreds of millions of dollars and made them pay for these educational campaigns, so now everyone knows that cigarettes are dangerous. Despite everyone knowing that cigarettes are dangerous, there's this huge tradition and a huge culture, and there's still people who were raised in the 50s and 60s who grew up on this stuff, who continue to smoke. And it kills lots of people, and they know it kills lots of people, and they continue to sell these products. So again, utilitarian reasoning, the little bit of joy that you get from the tobacco buzz, from the nicotine buzz, compared to the deaths and the lives lost, right? Tens of thousands of lives lost. How many people die from cigarettes every year? Yearly, 440,000 people yearly die of cigarette-related illnesses. 5 million people all around the world, almost 500,000 people in the United States, almost 500,000 people. That's 10 times as many people die of car accidents every year. Holy shit. That's a lot of people. Now, I made a tenuous connection earlier between tobacco and engineering, but the better case for engineering ethics is not tobacco, but it's the military-industrial complex, aerospace engineering, and weapons manufacturing. So these are the jobs that are highly coveted, sought after by engineers, right? Getting to work at McDonnell Douglas or Boeing, right? That would be a great job, a great career that could set you up for your life. These corporations also build war machines. They build machines whose purpose is to kill people, right? Especially not just gun manufacturers, but in the military-industrial complex, right? People making tanks and bombs and fighter jets and so on, right? The point of these machines is to kill people, often at great expense. I was complaining, I think, in the honors class about the F-35. I'm going to go ahead and keep talking about this since I'm on the subject. Lockheed Martin. Each one of these aircraft cost almost $100 million per aircraft. The whole program cost $1.5 trillion. The program itself is $163 billion over budget, 7 years behind schedule. F-35, it's the new fighter jet that they have. The thing about the fighter jet is that the military brass, they wanted the jet to be able to do vertical takeoffs and landings. So they wanted to be able to rotate the jet engines. They wanted to be able to rotate the jet engines down so that the plane can do vertical takeoffs and landings, which is really cool if it can do that, right? But the thing is that the equipment that you need to be able to do these vertical takeoffs and landings is very expensive, and it's also very heavy, which means that these airplanes are $100 million a piece, and they fly like shit. Like they're not good in the air. They can't maneuver. They're basically sitting ducks. So this $1.5 trillion weapons program is a complete waste of time. It produced machines that aren't any good. But there's almost no constraints on the military budget. The United States doesn't make its money from corporations because corporations don't pay very many taxes. The United States makes its money from the manufacture and sale of weapons, military weapons, like these fighter jets. Right? This is where all our United States money is going to the war machine. This is why we stay in the war. That's why we have the war on terror and so on. Perpetuate these systems. The F-35 is a complete waste of time and money. $1.5 trillion. $1.5 trillion could give everyone in America health care and a college education. but instead we spent them on planes to go up and down, and that don't even work. And thousands of engineers were involved in the construction of this machine. Right? And engineers are happy to be working for Lockheed Martin, working on important projects like these. Right? So I have an article on the tobacco industry called "How Do Tobacco Executives Live with Themselves?" But you might think about this: how do engineers live with themselves? How do engineers in the military-industrial complex live with themselves? These are consequentialist questions. These are difficult questions to ask. Come to class this week. Come to the hangout this week. Ready to talk about these questions. I think that's all I wanted to say. Thank you, everyone. I'll see you sometime this week. Yay.